Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Many in America believe we are the best country in the world, exceptional, the shining city upon a hill. The theory is we are superior because of our commitment to liberty, human rights, freedom, and democracy. After all, God blessed America. Really now. Take in point our genocidal war on Southeast Asia and Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, support for Israeli occupation and destruction of Palestine, and constant meddling in Latin America. USA, USA. Indeed, let's discuss. Well, warm greetings, Nathan Robinson. Gosh, it's good to have you again. We chatted with you about a year and a half ago with your book, Responding to the Right. That was, I think it was in spring of 2023. And we are talking to you today about your book, The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World. And this is it's a great story about you and your collaboration with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
Before we start that, I want to just say one thing. You are the editor of Current Affairs
Oh, you got the
magazine.
print issues. Yeah, there we go.
Gosh, I've got them all.
Oh,
So,
nice.
yeah, the other day, Paul, my wife was cleaning my office and she threw them out. I said, "What? You can't throw those
Never.
out."
Not a
So,
current affairs.
I'll let my
Throw out the Atlantic.
yeah,
Keep
yes,
current affairs.
I will let my kids throw those out when I die and they can curse at me. So
Nice.
anyway, you're editor of the Current Affairs, but you also written a book. I think your first book I remember reading, Why You Should Be a Socialist, Responding to the Right. This is your new book. You have a law degree from Yale and a PhD from Harvard in sociology and social policy. So welcome, Dr. Robinson.
Oh, it's so nice to be back with you. This is was one of my favorite podcasts I've ever done. Yours, especially first off because it's fun to talk to you both, and also because you send handwritten notes to people who are on your podcast.
That's true. That's true.
I got a little envelope, and it was the loveliest thing I've ever gotten on a podcast. No
Okay.
other podcast has ever done that, and
Well,
it's such a nice touch.
well, we're really pretty great. That's all I can
We're
say.
Midwesterners. We're both Midwesterners at heart.
Yeah, but let's start with your book. You
Do it.
started this book with Noam Chomsky. Just give the background. How you ended up with this project?
Yeah, it's kind of a fun story. I mean, obviously, I had read a lot of Chomsky books as a young person and was sort of radicalized by reading books like Failed States and Hegemony or Survival. But one of the things about Noam Chomsky is that even though he's the most cited intellectual in the world, he is also very open and accessible to members of the public. He's famous for kind of replying to every email. And he's also very supportive of little left publications. So he blurbs lots of books from small lefty independent publishers, and he subscribes to lots of left publications. So one of our readers had showed him a book that I did about Bill Clinton, and he liked it and said he liked it, which was really nice. And then he subscribed to our magazine. And he would email me when the magazine didn't show up, which was amazing because first off, just to have Noam Chomsky subscribing to your magazine is kind of amazing. And then to know that he actually cares enough to notice whether it doesn't show up was amazing. Like, oh, you actually want to read this? You read so much, you know. So and he would email me personally, and so we, corresponded a bit. And then I interviewed him for the magazine. I flew out to Arizona, to Tucson, to interview him once, and I interviewed him a second time a couple years later, and at some point in that, I said to him, I've been thinking about the fact that I think Chomsky's analysis is so important, so vital, but he'd mostly been doing interviews, and I thought, he really needs more. He really needs kind of a new book. He needs something that really brings up to date. The most comprehensive introduction to his works is like Understanding Power, which is based on stuff from the early 90s. A lot has happened since the early 90s. So at a certain point, I was like, Chomsky's not getting any younger. If you want this to happen, what you should do is you should go to him and you should ask him if you can help him produce a book that summarizes his arguments and updates them. And he said yes. So it happened.
People can't see, but behind me is Noam Chomsky's office, and his books are all, if you just look at a messy office, this was from his secretary. I haven't read her book. She has a memoir, Bev Stoll, of her time as being the secretary for Noam Chomsky, but he is just a very prolific reader and has a remarkable memory. I just noticed as a little fun fact, he has synesthesia, where you hear music and you see colors. And that tends to correlate with people with very high recall, photographic memory. And I think that's quite apparent that he gets his facts pretty correct. And part of what you did is you tried to go back and footnote all of these comments that he made and really try to find out, were they true, were they not? That must have been a Herculean task to do that.
Yeah. So so my role in the book was to sort of compile everything he'd said about anything that matters in U.S. foreign policy, and then to try and go through it with him to distill some of the things that he says over and over and over, so that clearly the things that really matter to him. And so I got dozens and dozens and dozens of Chomsky books and went through them. Some of the work was done for me because those books, other than some of the interview books, the books that he's put out are so heavily footnoted that there's just a wealth of sources. He's done the research. He's made the research available. And so usually when he says a thing offhand in an interview, you can go back to one of his own books and look at the endnotes and find what the original source was. So I did a lot of that, and I was tracking down the original sources because I had to verify that everything he had said was true. I didn't find a single, by the way, across dozens and dozens and dozens of Chomsky books, I did not find a single citation in any of his voluminous footnotes. And sometimes, like with certain books, like Towards a New Cold War, the endnotes are between a quarter and a third of the book. And I didn't find a single thing where the source that he'd given did not say what he said it said, which is pretty remarkable, because as an editor, I know that like when a writer turns in things and you go and you look at the sources, you're like, that's not what that says, constantly, even if they're a good writer. So yeah, photographic memory for sources. My job was very, very difficult and time consuming, but it was my job essentially was to take what he had done over the course of 50 years and help package it, update it, rework it with him. And so basically the 50 years of his work, that was the hard part. Mine was comparatively easy.
Yeah, fun fact, we had our president pretend that he was giving a microphone a blowjob, and you ended up having this is an example of this, that he mentioned somewhere that Johnson pulled out his penis in response to a reporter. People were getting mad at Johnson about the Vietnam War, and they said, speaking to the group, a reporter asked him a poignant question about our involvement. Why are we involved? And he literally pulled out his penis and said, because of this. And you said,
yes, this is why.
Where did this, is this true? Is this?
Yeah,
and
I couldn't believe that. I actually consulted with a historian of the Vietnam War, one of the leading historians, Christian Oppie. I emailed him because this anecdote about Lyndon Johnson is so wild that it's very difficult to believe. Like he actually, you're saying that the reporter asked him why we're in Vietnam, and he literally unzipped his pants and pulled out his penis and said, "This is why." And Oppie says, I forget exactly who the eyewitness to this was who recorded it, but it does come from eyewitness
The
testimony.
history connection, the whole article about it just said, yeah, you're not crazy. It happened.
No, it's because I said to Appy, is this reliable? Can I cite this? And he said, actually, as far as these things go, we do believe that it happened. And Johnson was kind of it's not actually aberrational because Johnson was kind of known for flashing people as a power move.
Yeah,
He was very vulgar. He was
disgusting, man.
It didn't start with Trump. I mean, vulgarity among presidents goes back a long ways. And there's lots of references to him to talking, having conversations while he's sitting on the toilet.
Right.
And his pants are down below his knees, and he's yapping away, and he's perfectly comfortable with it. That's just part of his vulgar lifestyle.
Intimidating, yeah.
What we understand is that his Johnson was sizable, so he liked to show it to people.
He was proud of it. He was very proud of his equipment. Yes.
Yeah, very, very proud. Well, okay, so I don't know if you know about Greg, but Greg is the editor and very involved with Marxist Leninist Today.
Mm-hmm.
In his most recent magazine article, he usually keynotes an article. What do you write about every 3 weeks or so, Greg?
Not every 3 weeks. They post about. I'm not the editor. I'm one of the editors. But
one of the editors.
Postings are about every 3 weeks.
And it just is interesting because you had a whole article about the global South and about Cuba. It's amazing how what Greg was saying in his article is similar to what Chomsky was saying, which is that, we're just often on the wrong side of history when it comes to these countries. This little country really means nothing, but the fact that it was so close to our borders, and we can't allow defiance in the South, in South America. And as Greg said in his article, if you look at Cuba with the Congo, with Chile, with Grenada, Venezuela, apartheid, Cuba has been on the right side of all of these arguments, and we've been on the bad side of them. I don't know, Greg, what are your thoughts about your Cuba article related to the general concept that we're not correct in how we respond to our foreign policy with the Central and South America?
Well, you have to ask the question, what are Cuba's interests and what are our interests? Our interests are our interest. I mean, this is a country that really operates and functions based upon its own elites, not yours and mine or Nathan's, but our elites' interest. Where Cuba is a socialist country, and as such, it doesn't have that same kind of class division. And of course, it can function internationally in a different way. We live in an era where corporate America is the government. It's fused. The fusion between monopoly capitalism and our government is fixed. It's at the highest level. And so our country always responds in the interest of corporate America. And that tends to be the opposite side from Cuba. I mean, Cuba's role in the elimination of apartheid is really not known in this country. It's never talked about. Nelson Mandela's first country that he went to after he was released from prison was to Cuba. And he said it consciously, that I must go to Cuba because apartheid came down because Cuban soldiers died in Angola fighting the apartheid regime's military and defeating it. It was defeated in Angola, and that's something that doesn't even get spoken to in this country. But today, when Cuba is in such dire straits, the point of my article is that it's unfortunate that many of the people that it came to the aid of are resource rich, much more so than Cuba is, are higher in the economic scale per capita, are much better positioned to help them. Since the demise of the Soviet Union, no one is really helping Cuba except on commercial terms, and they have very little to give in return. They just don't have it. With the blockade, they can't have it. They can't have anything. Right. So like Haiti, they've never been forgiven for having a socialist revolution. Haiti has never been forgiven for having a democratic revolution against a major power. And you see where both are. I mean, they're poor, and they remain poor until we remove this ugly blockade that's keeping them from developing.
Thoughts about that, Nathan?
Well, and I think we just had the vote in the UN that comes up every year in which every country, essentially except the United States and Israel, gives a condemnation of the US blockade against Cuba, points out that it is against international law, as an interference with, first off, it's a violation of everything we claim to believe, which is the freedom of commerce, as a basic freedom. That it's an interference with, it's a devastating strangulation of Cuba's economy that has been, going on now for 50 plus years. And Americans aren't told that every other country in the world essentially condemns this as an outrageous infringement on Cuba's right to prosper. And we've been doing it for a long time. The justifications for it, interestingly, have shifted. This is one thing that Chomsky pointed out that we put in the book, is that interestingly, at first, the justification was, that Cuba was interfering with U.S. investors' property in Cuba. At that time, Castro wasn't openly Marxist, but then the argument was we have to contain the Soviet Union, and then after the Soviet Union fell, we kept the blockade on Cuba. So the whole argument for the blockade disappeared, and then all of a sudden it became because Cuba is a human rights abuser, which of course is laughable considering, as we know, the much worse human rights abusers around the world that we give endless support to. So the justification has shifted over time, but as Greg pointed out, the ultimate justification for it, the unspoken one, has always been successful defiance, that Cuba defied the United States, continues to defy the United States, and has to be punished accordingly for its revolution. It overthrew the dictator we backed, and that was unforgivable. And it's interesting that when you go back, we have lots of quotes from, because now there's the history. The State Department's archives are online. The Office of the Historian, they're great, because you find memos, and they just say this quite openly. There are all these quotes. Successful defiance is not Chomsky's quote. That's like an internal quote. That's from Arthur Schlesinger or someone.
What Trump added, because Obama, there was an opening with Obama. It was not what it should have been, but it was an opening nonetheless, appreciated by the Cubans. What Trump added to it was putting them on the list of terrorist states.
Terrorist states,
that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, that Cuba is a sponsor of terrorism internationally. Cuba's responded to terrorism wherever it occurred, and most of the terrorism we've engaged in, the worst kind, has been directed at Cuba, whether it's the assassination of Fidel Castro, or whether it was the use of Deng infections. I mean, all kinds of really crude, vulgar terrorist
We
attacks
talk
on
about
Cuba.
In the book about U.S. terrorism against Cuba, which I think is also kind of unknown. I mean, people might know kind of in a comical way about the assassination attempts against Castro. We tried to, the exploding cigar and the poison wetsuit and whatever. But actually, it's very serious. It's a serious terroristic attempt to assassinate a head of state, and then also that wasn't it. There was all these campaigns of sabotage against Cuba, just attempts to wreck the Cuban economy, and real vicious terrorism, and yet we put them on the list of terrorist states.
I'm sure you reported on this, but one of the most absolutely absurdly ugly facts about Cuba and U.S. relations was Operation Northwinds. It was an operation organized by the Department of Defense, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it included considering blowing up a U.S. commercial plane and blaming it on the Cubans. Can you imagine justifying an attack upon Cuba, a military attack on Cuba? And this was considered seriously by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. By blowing up a U.S. plane and then setting it up in such a way that it would look as though Cuba caused it when we caused it, we would kill our own citizens.
Yeah.
That's the lengths that we would go to thwart Cuba. It's just unbelievable. Operation Northwinds, I believe it is.
One central theme in your book that I really liked is you quoted Well, you talked about how when Noam Chomsky's at his best is when people kind of come after him in debates and so forth. William
Mm.
F. Buckley, Foucault, you mentioned David Frum.
Yeah,
I,
yeah. It's a
I
great point of
looked
that.
up the David Frum debate that you or interaction that you looked at. It was 1988 debate in Toronto, and Frum and all of his pompous arrogance was trying to say to that Chomsky was just against America, and it's everything America does is wrong, and why don't you talk about other countries,
Mhm.
and of course he got it completely wrong, the spirit of what Chomsky was talking about, and Chomsky just basically put him down. Fromm, of course, goes on and becomes the architect of the Iraq
Yeah, he didn't learn anything from that
yeah, he's a
exchange.
typically neocon. And I love the concept that he's saying. He's saying, okay, there's all kinds of things going in the world that are bad. The Uyghurs, we don't like the way they're being treated. There's Saudi Arabia, there's this, but we can do something about our country, and that's what I want to focus on is that's why I criticize our country because we have the ability to do something about it. The other parts of the world we don't have the ability to do stuff about it. Talk a little bit about that and
Yeah.
that concept and how that fits with your book.
Yeah. So in that, people should look that up, the From Chomsky exchange, because From says, I noticed that you care a lot about a corpse that is created at the hands of the Americans, but you don't care as much about Kurdish corpses. Now, he picked a really bad example there because Chomsky's been a real stalwart supporter of the Kurdish cause, much more so than David Frum for a long time, as he pointed out. But he also said, look, why do I focus so much on the United States? Well, I focus on the United States because I am an American and these are my government's crimes. You don't ask this when an Iranian dissident or a Russian dissident criticizes their government. No one said of Soviet dissidents, well, why are they focusing on what the Soviet Union is doing? But with Americans who are criticizing the American government, there's this strange. In fact, we got a review of the book in the Irish Independent by someone who was making exactly this argument. He says, well, this book doesn't talk about Assad's crimes. And it's like, well, it's a book about U.S. foreign policy. Why would it talk? I mean, it doesn't talk about, lots of things. It doesn't talk about the South African government's crimes under apartheid because it's a book about U.S. foreign policy and it's a criticism of U.S. foreign policy. And it's a very, very strange criticism to make. People think that it's a powerful criticism because they say, oh, well, Chomsky, all he talks about is American crimes. He must hate America because he just talks America, America, America. No, but it's like, you really would not, this criticism would not make any sense and you would see why it doesn't make sense if it was applied to a critic from any other country. You would immediately see why people would discuss their own country.
Your book talks about, let me just go through a few of the chapters. It's the myth of us spreading democracy, that all we want to do is just be this wonderful mansion on the hill and make democracy throughout the world and have our values of freedom and individuality and so forth go forth. That's not necessarily correct. That's incorrect.
Right. Yeah, well, and the idea is that, to the extent that this perspective admits that there are terrible tragedies in the history of U.S. foreign policy. Vietnam, terrible tragedy. But, the Iraq War, terrible tragedy. Afghanistan, terrible tragedy. But the idea is that these are tragedies that come about. Ken Burns said at the beginning of his Vietnam War documentary, some line about it was a tragedy that came about as a result of good men trying to do their best. And, Chomsky's argument has always been, well, that's just not true. It's not true that we are trying to bring about democracy and then tragically failing. So in the Vietnam case, what he always pointed out is that we were supporting a dictatorship and preventing elections, right? Because we knew that the communists would win the elections if they were held. So we had to thwart democracy. In Chile, we overthrew Chilean democracy. We ended the democracy. And and Henry Kissinger has that quote, like, I don't see why we need to let some country go communist just because of the irresponsibility of its own people. The idea being, we believe in democracy if it produces the outcomes we want, but if it doesn't, then the principle of democracy is abandoned immediately. Hillary Clinton said after Hamas won the Palestinian elections in 2006, she said, well, why did we let them win? She said we should have done something to make sure they didn't win. Because we believe in sham democracy. We believe in the pretense of democracy. But if the democracy produces outcomes that we don't like, then immediately we move to squash it, as we did in lots of different countries, including Guatemala, where we helped contributed to the ending of democracy there, including, we talk about the Indonesian example in the 60s, the support for the mass killing of the Indonesian communists, tons and tons of cases. I mean, we range across the world. In Afghanistan, we're supporting a horrible, corrupt authoritarian government that was widely disliked among the people. These things aren't accidents. They are cases in which where the principle of democracy clashes with perceived U.S. interests, which, as Greg pointed out, are actually elite U.S. interests. Elite U.S. interests are just prioritized consistently over anything, any principled commitment to democracy.
I want to follow up with your Ken Burns quote. When I watched the Vietnam documentary, I turned it off after he said, we tried, we had good intentions, and Ezra Klein.
For 30 seconds, you lasted 30 seconds.
And then I finally went back and, just chipped away at it, and I got over my anger. But Ezra Klein, have you heard his comments about Palestine and Israel?
Oh, yeah.
They're identical. We tried. We tried to get the hostages back. We really wanted a two-state solution. It is an identical expression of what you were talking about in this book, this mendacity, I guess.
I've actually just written an article about this, which may appear in Current Affairs if I can't get published anywhere else, called A Year of Kabuki Diplomacy. And it's a review of Biden's supposed efforts to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. And basically the argument is that it's all a sham. I mean, the Biden administration has been saying over and over that they're trying to work for a ceasefire. But essentially what has happened is that Israel has said, we don't want a ceasefire. We want to pound and pummel Gaza until Hamas is destroyed. And the Biden administration has been unwilling to pressure Israel to abandon that commitment. And so if you're unwilling to, and they said at the outset, we're not going to push Israel to through the leverage that we have, which is withholding weapons. And so if you're not willing to do that, then there's no diplomacy, right? It's all a sham, because if you're not going to stop Israel from doing what it wants to do, and it doesn't want a ceasefire, then you're not negotiating for a ceasefire. There's no negotiation to be had. You've already made the commitment that you're going to support the country that doesn't want a ceasefire. So it's the same case. This is all presented as the Biden administration is trying so hard to do this diplomacy, but the diplomacy just keeps failing. But there's no failure, because we know why it's failing. It's failing because the Biden administration has a commitment to supporting Israel, even if it doesn't want a ceasefire, and it doesn't want a ceasefire.
The strength, I think, of Chomsky's work, and this is when I first started reading him back in the 60s regarding the Vietnam War, is his ability to smell hypocrisy. There's another word for what he smells, but he uses hypocrisy, U.S. hypocrisy, against U.S. policies. He shows that's his most powerful weapon when he writes. It's really, really very admirable how he does that, and it's very difficult for his critics to come back at that, because that really pulls the curtain back on what's going on. And it ties in closely with his writing about manufacturing consent and how that operates as well, how the media plays an important role in creating the opportunity to be hypocrites. I mean, you can only become hypocrites if there's an overriding narrative that everybody sort of accepts, that you pull the curtain back and you see that that's really hypocritical. So I think it's a really power of him. But I think what's missing often, what I sense is missing, it's my own feelings, is an overriding theory about what causes the U.S. to take the positions it takes.
Yeah.
A general position. I mean, he's never really written, as far as I know, on imperialism, except maybe anecdotally.
Yeah.
Maybe he doesn't want to, but I mean, I kind
No,
of
he doesn't
sense
want to.
Oh, really? That's interesting, Nathan. What
Yeah.
to elaborate?
Greg is completely right. This is one of the. I mean, this is a kind of fair Marxist criticism of Chomsky, which is that Chomsky documents all these facts, and exposes lies, and does so. Does all of this research, and and he's right about all this stuff, and so he'll produce like a very good analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he exposes the hypocrisy that is at the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is to say that we believed that we had the right to do to the Soviet Union what it did not have the right to do to us. That is to say, we could station nuclear missiles near their border, but they couldn't station nuclear missiles near our border. And we're willing to risk nuclear war in order to preserve the right to be hypocrites. And that's his analysis. And it's very powerful analysis when you put all the facts together. And it's very damning of the United States. But as Greg said, you'll notice in this book, actually, it's divided into two parts. And part one is all the facts. We go through the world. We go across regions of the world, from the Vietnam War to Afghanistan to Ukraine, and we document the facts. And then part two is kind of more analysis, a little more kind of stepping back and looking at commonalities across cases, a little more theoretical, but it's much shorter because Chomsky has always shied away from theory. And when you ask him questions like, well, but why? Why does this happen? What explains the facts? He usually gives you something like, well, he likes to cite, Adam Smith's quote about the masters of mankind. And he's basically like, well, the elites are always just trying to concentrate their own power. And that's the way it's always been. And that's the way it will always be. And that just basically explains it. And we don't need any further analysis. So he's always, I have felt a certain, my job in this book was not to give my own theory, but I wanted to help him articulate his views. But my kind of feeling of where I'd like to go next in foreign policy writing is to kind of step back and say, well, we have this body of history. How do we explain it? What is going on? What role does individual psychology have versus economic interests? How do those things interact? Like, Lyndon Johnson's like perceived emasculation. How does that relate to the economic foundations of war? How does Lyndon Johnson's individual does it matter at all? In determining U.S. behavior, the differences between presidents' personalities. Chomsky's always kind of showed an aversion to going down the path of doing this kind of analysis. I don't quite know why, but I think part of it is because he just believes there's such an urgency to just exposing the facts and just getting people to understand what is happening, that the why is it happening question is like, we could almost put that aside for another day. I don't know.
Right. Greg, you mentioned manufacturing consent, and you mentioned this book in Nathan Robinson. Nathan, it's the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins, and we had him on with his second book too. He's just a national treasure in his observation.
Yeah, that book's great.
And when you look at it's about what was going on in 1965 in Jakarta, and in manufacturing consent, if I remember, he was doing a comparison and contrast of why the media is concerned about some events and not concerned about other events. Mm-hmm. I hang around with pretty sophisticated, normal, intelligent people, and I don't think that the vast majority of them could give me a good cohesive paragraph on what happened in Jakarta in 1965. It was an absolute massacre against the Communist Party, which was showing presence in Jakarta. And we, America, funded killing 500,000 to 1 million Jakartans to stop to stop the spread of that. And the country to this day has never really recovered from that. So it's frustrating, I think, when you look at the manufacturing consent and the propaganda model. We don't, we often don't shed light where we should be shedding light because of the ownership of the media and the advertisements and the way in which we get our information. I don't know. What thoughts
Yeah,
about that?
I mean, what happened in Indonesia in 65, 66 is, should be one of the, most important events in the history of the 20th century because it's such a colossal massacre. The United States was completely complicit in it. In fact, we furnished the Indonesian military with lists of names of prospective communists so they could exterminate them. We have quotes in the book from CIA officials who said, yeah, one of them said, yeah, I probably have a lot of blood on my hands. But that's fine. That's fine. And yet it goes. Chomsky has shown that it was actually reported positively in the press. We're beating back communism. So at the time, it was the massacres were known, but they were reported as a good thing. And that's quite common. This obliteration. Bevins has in the books some great quotes about why is this unknown, and he says, well, one reason it's unknown is because if you admitted the facts, it would so shatter our image of ourselves as a force for good in the world, because this is something that can't be chalked up as a mistake. It's so evil and heinous that it just shatters our mythology to a degree where it can't enter the picture because it can't be reconciled with fundamental beliefs that we want to hold. And that's also true, I think, with the I just did a tie-in article for this book where I went through a kind of standard history text on U.S. foreign policy by the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he says I'm just introducing the history of foreign policy. And one of the things I pointed out is that he doesn't mention in the whole book, which has parts on Vietnam, he doesn't mention the bombing of Laos. And the bombing of Laos it's the most bombed country in the history of the world because of us. There are still children being killed by US bombs from the 60s in that country. And, you would think the largest bombing campaign in human history might warrant, I don't know, a footnote in a standard history of US foreign policy. But, this might be the major event. You might discuss it, and it doesn't even appear in a standard history. And Chomsky would point out that this is like, writing a German history book and skipping over the years from 1939 to 1945, or writing a Russian history book and skipping over the invasion of Afghanistan, or all sorts of things. It's clearly just distorted national mythology, and yet it's not noticed as that. It's not noticed as propaganda, even though when you set the facts next to the narrative, it's so bizarre that these sorts of things would be left out.
Here's a question regarding manufacturing consent. We don't have Chomsky to ask. We've got Nathan here, though, so I'd like to ask him. One of the things that I think he and his University of Pennsylvania co-author focused on was the monopolization of the media. The media was concentrating, and that's a factor in the way that consent has been manufactured and maintained and increased through the media, the role of the media. But you read a lot today, at this moment, after this election, about how a corner has been turned, how the legacy media no longer has the same kind of role or influence on the American people as do these new internet forms, these new ways of communicating, of getting information and so forth. I can't list them all, from TikTok all the way Facebook, the rest. We all know them. But would that change, do you think, in your estimation, would that change that picture that was developed in manufacturing consent of the role of the media? And does it matter today that the legacy media is losing some of its traction, just as the U.S. is losing some of its power in the world? The legacy media is diminishing in terms of its influence upon people.
Good
Yeah,
question.
so the analysis still holds true in regard to the legacy media, right? So everything that Chomsky and Herman wrote in Manufacturing Consent about the way that the New York Times measures what to cover, the way that they discuss things that we've done versus things that enemy states have done. I think you see those tendencies very much still in operation within those institutions, right? You can use the analysis of manufacturing consent, and it can really help open your eyes to when you're reading the Wall Street Journal, or you're reading USA Today, or you're reading CNN. But then, as you say, fewer and fewer people are actually getting news from those. Well, that's not quite true, because the New York Times, I think, has seen record subscriptions. But certainly trust in media has diminished, and the number of people who are getting news from alternative sources has increased. It's true that the analysis doesn't work quite as well for those alternate sources, for non-corporate media. You do have to. We are in a different time. Things have kind of changed, and there the picture is a lot more complicated, because you see uh, sometimes a lot of questioning of, like, for example, on TikTok, you saw that a lot of news about Palestine that wouldn't have been reported on CNN is, got to people via TikTok, got to people via Twitter. At the same time, there are some of the same tendencies. So if you take Twitter, for instance, it's true that a lot of Palestinian journalists have been able to reach people who they would never have been heard if there wasn't this platform. It's also true, however, that what Chomsky and Herman identify, which is to say the way that ownership of media affects content of media, is true on Twitter too. Twitter is owned by a billionaire, Elon Musk. Elon Musk literally, in a way that's even cruder than what happens in manufacturing consent, Elon Musk manipulates the Twitter
Oh
algorithm
God.
to make sure everyone sees his own opinions. And his own opinions are that he shouldn't have to pay taxes, that the government should be strangled, that social services should be cut, and that we should essentially further concentrate wealth in his hands. So in some ways, in these alternate platforms, an even cruder version of the manufacturing consent framework explains a bit about the relationship between ownership and content.
You're a perfect example. This is the riots that happened in Europe regarding the soccer hooligans,
Mm,
and the initial reporting that it was the Israeli soccer fans that were being persecuted and hunted down in anti-Semitic, riots, and that was reported in the Guardian, New York Times, legacy media. And I read Jonathan Cook. I read some other people
mm,
that are Democracy Now! Had a good article about it. It's just the opposite. You know that that during the moment of silence they were cheering and jeering. They were having chants. How come there are no how come schools out in Gaza? It's because all the children are killed. That
mm.
it was just the complete opposite of what was being reported in the legacy media. And now things are starting to catch up. And the question is, where will this ultimately prevail? I doubt the legacy media will admit that it made a mistake in how they misinterpreted the film, and the movies of the events were taken by the photographer, said that they completely misrepresented what she saw as she was
Mm.
observing these soccer riots. I don't know. It's Joe Rogan has 40 million people watch his show. MSNBC has a million. It's amazing how this might alter things, and how media is getting information out. I don't know.
You do see, I mean, unfortunately, it turns out that having non-corporate media is not a cure-all. Things can actually get worse in some ways. You take Joe Rogan, who you mentioned, for example, and that is a guy who now has a kind of independent platform. He gives voice to dissident opinions. He would never have Chomsky on. He actually refused to have Chomsky on, interestingly.
Hmm.
But he nevertheless has had some dissident opinions on. But he's also a guy who doesn't do any research, and he's not a trained journalist, and he's not a trained researcher, and he doesn't check his facts. So he says all sorts of complete nonsense. I've done a long article about Joe Rogan and all that. I mean, he had a guy on who believes Atlantis is real, and they had a whole episode about where Atlantis is. He didn't check any of this. He was just fascinated by the idea that Atlantis was real. So it's outside of the corporate media framework, but on the one hand, I like that the New York Times does fact check stuff. They are a little bit, I mean, we can be cynical, but we shouldn't be too cynical because there's a lot of good journalists who work there, and they phrase things in ways that can that it could be propagandistic or distorting, but they rarely have outright factual falsehood. Sometimes they do, but oftentimes, I mean, a huge amount of the citations in this book are in the New York Times. You can go to the middle of the article and you can find what actually happened and just see how it's being framed incorrectly.
Hmm.
Like the infamous headlines about Gaza are in the kind of passive voice where they say things like, they have headlines like a few years back when a few children were killed. It was like, in the wreckage of a cafe, children, fans who had come for soccer. That's how they described the headline should have been Israeli missile strikes cafe in Gaza, killing fans watching soccer games. But they had in the wreckage of a cafe fans who had come for soccer or something like that, right? And so, but the facts are in the article. They reported the news. So the good thing is that you can actually find the facts in there. Whereas if you have totally unvetted stuff, you get things like the story in this campaign of the Haitians eating the cats, where it's like, someone posted it on Facebook, and then someone read the Facebook post, and then another person read the Facebook post and amplified it, and then it became a story, and all of a sudden the president-elect is saying that this is true.
Hey, I want to talk about what a nice guy Chomsky is for a second.
Yes.
We had on um, Norm Finkelstein,
Oh yeah.
and he talked about how he was so influenced by Chomsky, his
He loves
absolute
him. Yeah.
mentor. And we had on Vijay Prasad, who wrote a
Mhm.
book with Chomsky on Cuba, absolutely adores him. Greg has a dear friend, Dan Kovalik, who's traveled the world doing
Oh yeah.
human
Dan's
rights.
Dan's real smart. Yeah.
He's hung out with Chomsky in his office in MIT. He just really seems to be so generous with his time and his ability to correspond. Hang on, I want to show you one thing here.
Yeah.
I like Chomsky, and I'm always sending my sons articles about Chomsky. They never read them. They just think I'm a crazy as a loon hoot because I like Chomsky so much. I sent Chomsky a picture of my personalized license plates that say Chomsky, and I said, would you please sign this for a Christmas presents for my two sons?" And so he literally signed. He returned it. He signed the
Yeah.
photographs, sent them back, and
Yeah.
and said, enjoy your Christmas present. I'm a nothing. I just said, would you,
Yeah. It,
this is his. How can he do this to
it's crazy.
so many people?
I can't. You have. I mean, I've talked to lots and lots of people who have had interactions with Chomsky, who've emailed with him, daily for years, um, and they're just members of the public. And I asked Bev Stoll, who you mentioned, who was Chomsky's office manager for 20 years. I said, how long did he spend answering people's emails and letters? And I mean, it must have been 6+ hours per day of just continuous work trying to answer as much of his correspondence as possible. And you can imagine, in fact, I suspect, I don't, this has not been verified, but I think if there was a Guinness World Record for most emails sent ever by a human being, I believe Chomsky might have it because he started doing email at the beginning of email. So when email started, so Chomsky started doing it, and then continuously since the beginning of email technology, he had been emailing people for 6+ hours a day. And I think if you do that, Chomsky might well have the world record for most emails ever sent by a human being.
Yeah, his Sam Harris interactions where he went back and
Oh
forth
God,
with Sam
yeah.
Harris and all of that, and I don't know. He just is. It's quite remarkable. I hate to take up all the conversation, but I have a small confession to make. There was a period of time where I actually liked Jordan Peterson because I initially became involved with him through his psychology. He's a pretty good
Okay.
psychologist with personality psychology and so forth. And I read his books and everything. And I remember seeing a article once where someone asked him about Jordan Peterson. This is way back when, and he said, read the article in Current Affairs about Jordan Peterson. That says that's my opinion. That's just, go ahead and do that. And I did, and it changed. It completely made me realize that I was a complete idiot for giving him so much credence on public opinions on things other than his field, which is
Yeah.
psychology, personality psychology. I don't know. That was kind of a
Yeah, Chomsky was kind
side
enough
note.
to always promote our current affairs article about Jordan Peterson. Every time anyone asked him, emailed him and they said, "What do you think of Jordan Peterson?" He'd just go, "Read this." That
Yeah,
was one
yeah,
of the ways that I got talking to him. So he liked
yeah.
that piece so much.
Well, good. Any last thoughts, Greg?
Oh, enjoying this. This is, yeah, let me ask a question. How
Mm.
can we have a podcast in November after the election without asking our participants to discuss briefly the election,
Yeah.
a couple of thoughts about this
That's
past election
that's
and
good.
but more importantly, what it means. I mean, not so much where you stand, but what does it mean? What do you think it means going forward? I think we'd be remiss in not putting a couple of minutes
Yeah.
into this topic.
Well, I mean, one of the things I've been proud of with current affairs is that we've had a pretty good track record of pointing out democratic failures before they happen. So our magazine became successful in 2016 when we ran an article saying Trump is going to win unless the Democrats pick Bernie instead of Hillary. And after Trump won, not many people had been saying that at the time. We got a bunch of subscribers, and we were pointing out in this election that Joe Biden needed to drop out and there needs to be a real primary. And we were saying over and over, there needs to be a primary, there needs to be a primary. And there wasn't a primary. And then it became clear that Joe Biden was, in fact, not capable of running for president. And then we were pointing out that Kamala Harris was making bad decisions by running with the Cheney family, who are deeply unpopular. So the election result was not terribly surprising because one of the themes that we've been writing about in current affairs for 8 years is that Democrats, when they don't deliver popular, easy to understand policies that transform people's lives in meaningful ways, they can expect to have Trump's populist, pseudo-populist appeal resonate. And this is kind of the core argument that we've made. I think that argument has been vindicated by the fact that vacuous centrism seems to be very unpopular, and Donald Trump is back with a vengeance. Which, again, just to say, if you go back, Current Affairs 2020, after that election, after Trump lost, we ran an article in November 2020 called "He'll Be Back," in which we said that Biden would probably be very weak and unpopular, and then Donald Trump would come back in 2024 and win. So there's the question of what it means in terms of why did it happen, and then there's the question, what is it going to mean in terms of policy? And in foreign policy, this is Chomsky's specialty, what we wrote about in the book. one of the things that he has always pointed out, that we point out, is that there's a lot of continuity between presidents, actually. So you might not see that much of a difference between. It's hard to think of how much more supportive Trump can be of Israel, for example, than Biden has been. He might give them the green light to fully resettle Gaza, but Biden has done very, very little to restrain anything Israel wanted to do. So is foreign policy going to change? Does it mean anything for that? Maybe Trump is more hawkish towards China and Iran and Venezuela, but not by much. And I think probably, Greg, that as a Marxist, you probably share the analysis that there's more similarity between U.S. presidents than there are differences because they are a product of the class structure of society.
Yes.
So you might see you're going to see some differences in domestic policy. You're going to see the gutting of environmental protections. You're going to see the gutting of labor regulations, and it's going to be pretty vicious. Trump has obviously got authoritarian tendencies. It's unclear how bad that's going to be. We might be surprised by how little changes, though. I don't know. I can't predict the future of how much different a second Trump term is going to be than a first Trump term. But for those of us who oppose right-wing authoritarianism, as those of us here and probably those listening too, we are viewing this election as an opportunity to say, okay, well, clearly centrism has been deeply discredited. Now we need to start from scratch and start building a powerful alternative that can actually speak to people.
Well, the Democratic Party kind of screwed the pooch. I mean, exit polls, a third of all people said they were Democrats. They completely lost labor. They went for the Republican suburban moms rather than the union people, and that didn't work out very well. I see it as I don't know. There has to be it just more of the same isn't going to do anything. It's just going to continue with the people not choosing them. I don't know. You just got back from Illinois, Greg. You are reminded of this.
I leave Pittsburgh. I live in Pittsburgh, Nathan, and I left Pittsburgh, and all I see are Harris signs, and occasional Trump signs. Like, oh, what's that doing here? Then I get to Central Illinois, where I grew up, and Pat knows so well. And it's all Trump signs, and you rarely see a Harris sign. But I know the people. I mean, I grew up there. They're not bad people. They're not the kind of people that the Eastern elites portray them as. They're people that have been abused. They've fared very poorly under successive administrations, particularly by voted Democratic. They've been very, very disappointed. So you see this turn. But I agree with everything you said, Nathan. I mean, I can't find anything to pick on there. I would just suggest that I did to one of our guests before the election who was talking about how important abortion was or would be to the election, and I tend to agree. You have to explain why it is that this right, quote unquote, populism is so successful, not only here under the name Trump, but in France, Le Pen, in Italy, where Maloney is in power, in Austria, where they're taking power, about to take power,
Hungary.
Germany, where the AfD is growing enormously. It's an international phenomena. So it has to be addressing something far deeper than just abortion or just race, something much deeper than that. I suggest it's class, and I think maybe you agree.
Yeah.
But that's the key, I think, to get out of this mess, is to start saying, what is the real issue here? What really is pissing people off?
That's it. I mean, that's my observation about it. There's something deep churning here that isn't being tapped into, and we keep getting distracted and very successfully manipulated by people looking at it's kind of squirrel. It's this problem, that problem, this problem.
The manufacturers of consent. That's the problem.
Hey, thank you so much. And I always say I like the books, I like things, but I really like this. I'm going to buy a bunch of copies of this and make people read it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Howard Zinn's The People History of the United States. This is sort of, the people's history of how Chomsky interprets the United States.
Yeah.
And I see you're in this too. I'm assuming the last chapter, which I thought was the best chapter, the chapter of hope, the chapter of what can we do about all
Chomsky
of
can be
this.
bleak.
Pardon me?
Chomsky can be bleak.
Yeah, yeah,
Bleak.
and I thought it was good. You know, we can get
Yeah.
together. We can, you know, movements can have an effect, and people can have
Yeah.
an effect, and don't give up. Stick with it,
Yeah.
and that chapter of hope, summarizing mass collective action and the power of public engagement, I think it was a good way to end the book. And
Yeah. Thanks,
there you
Pat.
go.
Thanks, Pat.
All right, thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Nice
Bye now.
reading. All right.
Thanks,
See you.
Nathan. Thanks very much.